Hello and welcome to another Shemita from Israel session. I am Kobi Cohen, Bnei Jashurun's Israel educator. Before we start, I would like to invite Rabbi Shuli Peso to say a couple of words. Shuli?
Thank you, Kobi. Good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. Thank you for being here for this program, which we've had in the works for a while and are really excited about it. We can't move forward this morning without, of course, mentioning yesterday's events in Texas. And I just want to say, first of all, of course, how grateful we are, along with the members of Torah of Israel and everyone who was praying for a safe and good outcome yesterday. How grateful we are that they are okay. Of course, there was a loss of life in this situation, which is always something to be acknowledged and not to have simcha over. But I want to note particularly that this program today is part of our Shemitah programming. And we've been talking about Shemitah this whole year as an opportunity to envision the world that we want to be, the world as it should be, in recognition, recognizing that we're not yet there. And yesterday's events were, of course, a very devastating reminder of yet another way in which our world is not how we want it to be, and a reminder of how this year should prompt us and agitate us to think about what is our role, where do we have agency, where do we have space in creating change in any regard. So I also want to note, I see a couple of our members here from Texas, and I know particularly across that whole state, this is hitting home. So want to just honor that and recognize that people are coming to this situation with varying degrees of proximity to the community that was directly affected, even though we are all part of the Jewish community. And so our prayers are with the families and the hope for a full spiritual and mental recovery, as well as the physical safety that they are experiencing now. I think many of you may have already seen that there is going to be a virtual community-wide vigil tonight with the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan and other institutions on the Upper West Side. And BJ has sent out some information about that. Kobi, I think, is going to put the link in the chat for those who would like to join this evening at 5:30 for more of a space to be together as the Jewish community in recognizing yesterday's events. But now we're here to look at Shemitah in a very different way, and hopefully an inspiring and hopeful way. So I will turn it back to Kobi to introduce our speaker and move forward with the program this morning.
Thank you very much, Shuli. And I have shared the link to the Zoom event, to the virtual event tonight at 5:30. I would like to ask that you will turn off any notifications you may have, so we'll have, so we will all be focused on our session and our speaker. Please mute yourself until we open the sessions to questions. Shemitah is one of the biggest and most fascinating ideas in Judaism. It asks us to let the earth rest, take a time out for insatiable desire for more stuff, enable people sunk in depth to turn a new page, and all of us up to pause, take a deep breath, and get alive. In this session, we will explore how Shemitah became what it is today, and some of the fascinating directions for renewing the social and environmental dimensions of Shemitah that are emerging in Israel and beyond. Our guest speaker today, Rabbi Yediya Sinclair, is an economist, writer, and a rabbi. He began his career as an economist advising the UK government, was vice president and senior economist at Energia Global, an Israeli solar developer, and works as an independent consultant of development projects in Africa. Yediya was senior rabbinical advisor for Hazon and campus rabbi at Cambridge University, where he also taught Jewish studies in the Divinity School. He holds degrees from Oxford and Harvard universities and lives with his family in Jerusalem, where he enjoys tour guiding in his spare time. His book, The Sabbath and the Land, will be published by Magid Books in February. And I'm really excited to have you here, Yedidia. Thank you for joining us. And I'm gonna let you continue.
Thank you very much, Kobe. I want to express also our shock and sympathies from Israel about what happened yesterday. We're very relieved that the hostages all came out of it safely, and we wish everybody in the American Jewish community to be well and safe and well protected, and that hopefully we won't see more things like this in the future. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really honored and excited to be part of this program. When Kobe explained the idea of the Torah from Israel project and the importance that it places on understanding what's going on in Israel, actually, I was very excited about that because I think it acknowledges a very important thing, that if you support Israel, if you're interested in Israel, if you care about what happens in Israel, it's really important to know what's going on here. And based on knowledge, one can form one's opinions and take a stance. But actually knowing what's happening is the basis. And so I think it's great that you have this program. I think every American Jewish institution and synagogue should have a program like this. And so kol hakavod, as we say in Israel, to Kobe and Rabbi Shuli and everybody else who's involved in this, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I also want to wish everybody a happy Martin Luther King Day, which I think is tomorrow. I don't know if Martin Luther King Day is a one-day Yom Tov or a two-day Yom Tov or a three-day Yom Tov in just one day. Okay, so it's Erev Martin Luther King Day. But anyway, I think it's quite appropriate that we're talking about Shemitah in Israel on Martin Luther King Day. First of all, because King was a great supporter and admirer of Israel amongst the original civil rights leaders, and also because in King's idealism and rhetoric on behalf of civil rights and emancipation obviously drew a great deal on his reading of the Bible, including and perhaps particularly what he called the Old Testament, what we call the Tanakh. When he spoke of called for "Let Freedom Ring," he was certainly referring to the song. But he would have certainly known, and probably the authors of the song were aware as well, that was a reference to the Liberty Bell, which you can still see in Philadelphia, which has engraved on it verses from Leviticus chapter 25 about the Shmitah, and Shmitah as an ideal of human freedom and emancipation. So it is quite. I'm quite sure that when King used that phrase as a biblical scholar and a preacher, he knew perfectly well that he was referring to the ideal of the Shemitah in his call for civil rights and emancipation for all, and for America to live up to its original founding ideals. So I think it's appropriate to be talking about this on this day. And Tu B'Shvat, somebody mentioned. I'll get to that at the end. But thank you. So I want to speak, as was advertised in the title, about what's going on in Israel today to make Shemitah alive and relevant and real. But to get to that, that's what most of the talk is going to be about. But to get to that point, I want to pick up from where my good friend, Professor Yehuda Mirsky, left off with you, I believe, a month ago. You're certainly very privileged to hear Yehuda, one of the really great scholars of Rav Kook's thought, and everything that she writes is worth reading. And I believe, for those of you who were there, that the Yehuda spoke about the situation in Israel around Shemitah in the early decades of Jewish resettlement of Israel, and the crisis around Shemitah that was engendered, and how Rav Kook responded to that. So, just very briefly, for those of you who weren't there, Shemitah in the Bible makes quite difficult demands of people and of society. It calls for everybody to stop working the land for a year. It calls for a remission of debts. It calls for opening up your fields to the poor so everybody can come and eat. So, the history of Shemitah has, perhaps not surprisingly, been a clash between those very high and transformative ideals and the demands of the real world, which says, well, hang on, that's not so simple, and how are we going to do that? And the beginning of Jewish resettlement in Israel, starting from the 1880s, aroused one of these clashes between the ideals of Shemitah and the reality. Because the early settlers were mostly religious Jews, and they were trying as best they could to eke out a living in incredibly difficult circumstances, and they suffered terribly, poverty and malnutrition, and tragically many of them lost numbers of children because of the circumstances. And then when the first Shemitah came around, 1888 to 1889, what do we do? How are we going to do this? I mean, seriously, we're not going to work for a year. We're barely hanging on as it is. Well, God forbid we'll have to move back to Russia or lose our land, or who knows? And so it was really hard for people to understand that how much as they wanted to observe Shemitah, how they could practically do it. So as Yehuda will have explained to you, Rav Kook came along with a solution. He actually didn't invent the solution, but he gave a halachic legal argument for it, which was far deeper and more serious than anybody had given before. And with the result that it became the solution for Shemitah in the land of Israel. And as Yehuda will have explained to you, Rav Kook's idea was this: that in a somewhat similar way that the halacha allows people, instead of getting rid of their chametz, their leavened stuff during before Pesach, if you've got a lot of it, like if you've got a beer factory, say, or you've got a really great collection of single malt whiskey, then it's difficult and perhaps painful to imagine pouring your single malt whiskey down the sink, right, before Pesach. It can be worth a lot of money, that whiskey. So you don't, rather than having to do that, the halacha will let you sort of temporarily and kind of fictitiously sell your chametz, your bread, beer, whiskey, whatever it is, to a non-Jew for the duration of the Shemitah year. And so you don't have to get rid of it. So the idea was to apply the same concept to Shemitah. This is how it went, right? If you were a farmer in the land of Israel, before Shemitah comes around, you could temporarily and sort of fictitiously sell your land to a non-Jew for the duration of the Shemitah year, and kind of everybody knew that it was just a kind of a way around it. And with that, you could pretty much carry on as normal. Now, we could talk a long time about the halachic legal basis for that, and how Rav Kook argued for it, but that's not our subject for tonight. If anybody wants to ask about it, I'd be happy to go into it a bit during questions. But sort of the overriding reason and motivation behind it for Rav Kook was just the incredible importance that he placed on what these farmers were doing. Now, he thought that what they were doing by creating a foothold in the land of Israel was literally the beginning of the redemption of the Jewish people, and that it was the beginning of the realization of the messianic prophecies and the ingathering of the exiles, which ultimately, and how long ultimately was going to take was he didn't say, but was ultimately going to lead to the messianic era, which we've been hoping and praying for thousands of years. So what they were doing was the most important thing in the universe. Literally everything depended on it. And so he wanted to do everything he could to help them survive and to help them maintain the precarious foothold that they had established in the land of Israel. So that was the overriding, if you like, meta-halachic motivation. It's not, he had real legal arguments, but behind his real legal arguments, he had an overriding motivation to make this work for the farmers. So there's little doubt that Rav Kook probably meant this innovation to be temporary. He says as much. He said, I understand this is a kind of a workaround. It's not the greatest, but it's what we have to do with the farmers being in this weak position. But one day, and he didn't say again when one day is going to be, but one day we're going to be in a position, he said, where we're not going to need this anymore. And we're going to be able to observe Shemitah as it really should be observed. And he actually talks about what that meant to him, Shemitah as it really ought to be observed. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in a moment. However, it didn't quite turn out like that, because I guess the solution was so good and so convenient for people that it stuck. And for the next 100 years or so, after Rav Kook wrote his book, Shabbat Haaretz, laying out this solution, for the next 100 years, this was basically the way that most farmers and most eaters dealt with Shemitah in the land of Israel. And most farmers would, they'd send a fax to the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And I think even today, you still have to send a fax to do this because they're not very advanced, the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Saying they gave authority to sell their land, and then they would sell their land, and nothing really changed, and they went on as before. Now, like a minority of people, mainly the Haredi, that's known as the ultra-Orthodox communities, were really, really unhappy about this, and they thought, well, come on, I mean, this is just a blatant way of ignoring a commandment of the Torah. You can't be serious. And everybody can see that this is a ruse and a fiction. How can you allow this? And so they never really signed on to this, and they found other ways of dealing with Shemitah, most of which were also had their problems. So, for example, until today, the Haredim, the most kosher thing you can eat in Shemitah is stuff which grows outside of the land of Israel, because there's no problems with Shemitah at all. And so for the Haredim, food coming from Jordan is great, food coming from Egypt is great, food coming from Gaza is great. And Israel's imported actually quite a lot of tomatoes and aubergines for the Haredi community from Gaza. And that works for them. But then, the Zionist communities say, well, really? We're like paying money, which is going to end up in the pockets of Hamas, who were just shooting rockets at us, 6 months ago. Is that a great solution? So all the solutions have their problems, but it's just, the question is which problem, you prefer to deal with. So that's, that's the way Shemitah has been for the last 100 years, essentially keeping Shemitah by avoiding keeping Shemitah. but the funny thing was, right, that each time you couldn't forget about Shemitah, because, you had to, if you were a farmer, you had to sell your land. And if you were a consumer, you had to look at the label on the vegetables to make sure that like it would be done the way you wanted it to be done. So Shemitah kind of continued to exist in the consciousness, but sort of more kind of as a problem and as a kind of a headache, which you had to face up to every 7 years. And not really, or it has to be said, as an opportunity or as a spiritual ideal or as a set of values or as anything which actually was relevant to your real life. But as well as giving this workaround solution, Rav Kook in his same book, Shabbat Haaretz, did something else. He wrote an introduction in this beautiful, poetic and lyrical register about how amazing Shemitah would be when we could really do it properly. He envisaged Shemitah as this society-wide opportunity for social renewal and for economic justice and for really a complete transformation of how life and society and human relationships felt in once every 7 years. I'm going to just bring you a short passage of this just to give you a flavor of what Rav Kook was talking about. And also why it was so important that he did this, because he was doing something very, very paradoxical and something with an inherent tension built into it. On the one hand, he was saying, like, for now we can avoid Shemitah. And on the other hand, he was saying, but we don't really want to avoid Shemitah. We really want to do Shemitah because this is how amazing it will one day be. So you can probably see the inherent instability in that solution. But here's a brief passage from Shabbat Haaretz to give you a flavor of what Rav Kook was talking about. Can people see see what I've shared? Yeah, give me a nod. Excellent, great. So this is a short paragraph from Rav Kook's introduction to Shabbat Haaretz, which is part of what I've translated and annotated in the book, which is coming out from Koren shortly. So Rav Kook says, what Shabbat does for the individual, Shemitah does for the nation as a whole. So he's just been talking about how Shabbat is an opportunity and a period of time, in which we can rest, step back from the hurly-burly of the week, and yet let our inner soul, which is often suffocated by the demands of the workaday week, rest and breathe and expand and find expression. That, for Rav Kook, is fundamentally what Shabbat is about. It's giving our souls space to breathe. And he says what Shabbat does for the individual, Shemitah does for the nation as a whole. The Jewish people, in whom the godly creative force is planted eternally and distinctively, has a special need to periodically reveal the divine light within itself with full intensity. So Rav Kook believed that each of us has a kind of a divine light within us, which is our soul, and it's there, ready and waiting and wanting for us to tap into it and to give it space. This is actually how Rav Kook understands the idea of prayer. And he has a beautiful passage in which says, really, the soul is always praying, but meaning that the soul is always wants, to expand and to escape from its confines and to reach out towards God. That's what the essence of prayer is for Rav Kook, who was a mystic, clearly. And the actual times when we pray, when we go to synagogue or we pray in whatever way we do, those are times when we actually, what we're trying to do is give the soul space to do what it really wants to do all the time. So he applies this idea to Shemitah as well. He says, our mundane lives with their toil, anxiety, anger, and competition do not entirely suffocate this creative force. On Shemitah, our pure inner spirit may be revealed as it truly is. The forcefulness that inevitably is part of our regular public lives lessens our moral refinement. There's always a tension between the ideal of listening to the voice inside us that calls us to be kind, truthful, and merciful, and the conflict, compulsion, and pressure to be unyielding that surround buying, selling, and acquiring things. So I spend a good deal of my life in the world of business, and I know what he's talking about. I think of myself, as a good person, and I try and be decent and compassionate and caring in all different areas of my life. But in the world of business, there is this pressure, if you're going to survive or succeed, to be, tough in a certain way and unyielding and stand on your rights and insist on what's yours, and so that people don't walk all over you. And that's that's just part of what the living in the commercial world is about. As I learned when I left the world of Jewish education and non-profits for the world of business, it has its advantages, but it also has its pressures and constraints. And Rav Kook was very much aware of that. And Rav Kook is saying that those pressures of the world of business tend to suffocate, this inner moral refinement of our godly soul, which is always seeks expression. So these aspects of the world of action distance us from the divine light and prevent its being discerned in the public life of the nation. This distancing also permeates the morality of individuals like poison. Right? So if individuals and if a society is so involved in the pressures of buying and selling and acquiring things, then that's going to affect the public character of the nation, and it permeates the morality of individuals like poison, which is a nice way of saying, it can make people not very pleasant, people if their lives and their characters become entirely taken over by this way of being. Stilling the tumult of social life from time to time in certain predictable ways is meant to move this nation, when it is well ordered, to rise towards an encounter with the heights of its other inner moral and spiritual life. They touch the divine qualities inside them that transcend all the stratagems of the social order and cultivate and elevate our social arrangements, bringing them towards perfection. Just as it was said about the Sabbath of creation, it's a Sabbath for God, so it's said about the Sabbath of Shemitah, it's a Sabbath for God. In other words, a Sabbath a whole year for the godly inside us to rise up and seek expression in our lives. Now you can see that this is, I think it's very beautiful and inspiring, but an extremely ambitious vision of what Shemitah could be. The idea that it could, we could still commercial life and stop work, or at least work much less, and our lives would not be defined by buying and selling and acquiring things, and the conflict and compulsion and pressure that comes from that. How do you do that? And Rav Kook, it has to be said, was a little bit light on the details of how you do that, particularly in a modern society. But his writings, and he goes on in this vein for pages and pages and pages. His writings have this profound conviction in them that this could happen and that one day this will happen. So now fast forward 100 years. And two things I would say three things have happened, to fundamentally disturb this unstable solution around Shemitah. The unstable solution was avoiding Shemitah. And it was unstable because the very man who proposed it also insisted that one day, hopefully soon, we would not avoid Shemitah, but we would realize it in all its beauty and brilliance. So 100 years or so after Rav Kook wrote, a few things happened. I'd say there's two profound and important trends in Israeli culture and society, which it's important to be aware of, and maybe you are, but which both fed into the renewal of Shemitah, which has happened in the last 10, 12 years. The first is the merging of the boundaries between the religious and the secular in Israel. I don't know to what extent people are aware of this, but people in 20, 25 years ago used to talk about the religious secular divide as one of the most disturbing conflicts in Israeli society. And there are still extremists on both sides whipping up tensions, but that's really gone, I would say. And it's gone because of a wide-scale merging of the boundaries. So on the one hand, over the last 20, 25 years, many secular Jews and thought leaders and leaders of culture in Israel have figured that actually religion is too important to be left to the religious, right? That religion is the vital source of culture in Israel and the public character in Israel. And the secular Jews feel like we need to own this as well. We can't just leave it to the religious to interpret this amazing panoply of books for us. Like, we need to know what we think about this stuff. So an incredible proliferation of study programs and secular Batei Midrash and all kinds of ways in which secular Jews are engaging in Jewish tradition and Jewish learning in a way which they never were before. And for many of them, that leads to some kind of broader engagement in Judaism, not necessarily becoming religious. In fact, for most of them, not becoming religious, but maybe observing Shabbat in their own way, or taking on other Jewish customs and practices, and becoming in some way closer to Jewish tradition. And on the other hand, the religious communities, which I would say 25 years ago felt quite isolated and embattled in Israel, become much more confident. They've reached out and they've entering the media, and you're having religious filmmakers and theatrical directors and authors and poets and entrepreneurs and lawyers and judges, and so this community, which was kind of quite isolated in battle, has become really part of the mainstream. And in that way, it's also, in terms of the edge of the religious community, which is most engaged with secular Israel, which is less secular than it used to be. There is a kind of an openness and a porousness around the boundaries with the secular, which wasn't there 20, 25 years ago. And so the way this has affected Shemitah is that this would provide an opening for both sides to embrace Shemitah and see broader socioeconomic and spiritual meanings. That it need not just be about what vegetables do you eat and what rabbinic certification you accept, but it was actually, there were real values here. Debt relief, socioeconomic equality, letting the land rest, ecology, taking a break from from frenetic work. These are really, really important values which speak to our contemporary reality. And that's so across the spectrum, activists and educators, both religious and secular, and particularly in the meeting place between those two worlds, thought, hey, maybe we should stop avoiding Shemitah and start embracing it. Maybe there's a real opportunity here. So that's what was one major trend. And the other major trend is the way in which over the last decade or so, I think Israel has been able to open up its sort of political and policy discourse to many issues outside the security framework, which were really not part of serious discourse before. So what I mean is that 10 years ago, 15 years ago in Israel, you would say, talk about socioeconomic gap, that there's a lot of poor people in Israel. Say, but we've got Hamas to worry about, we've got Iran to worry about. When we don't have to worry about Hamas and Iran anymore, then we'll deal with socioeconomic gap. Or climate change. If people would, what are we doing about climate change? Well, the answer was at that time, 15 years ago, not all that much. And it was like, let the larger countries deal about it. With climate change, we've got Iran and Hamas, and when we dealt with it, and so on. And probably about 10 years ago, there was really a sea change in Israeli culture in that respect. And it came about really around the social justice protests over in the summer of 2011, when hundreds of thousands of people came out onto the streets to protest about socioeconomic issues, about the high taxes on imported food, which made prices really important, really high, about the crazy prices of apartments in Tel Aviv. So if you were young, you had virtually no chance of living there. And just many other socioeconomic cost of living issues, which had really been sort of pushed off the agenda before because Iran, Hamas, all that. And people, Hamas and Iran are not going away for the time being, but these are really important issues. We can't just ignore them. We got to deal with them at the same time as we deal with with Hamas and Iran. And so that happened, in the run-up to the last Shemitah year, and people across the spectrum religious and secular, saw Shemitah as a way and as a framework for seeing some of these, profound issues in Israeli society, ecological, socioeconomic, which were suddenly coming into public consciousness and dumping themselves on the public policy agenda in a way which they hadn't previously done. So what actually happened? Just to be clear, I'm not share screening, correct? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay.
Not yet.
So what actually happened? Well, leading up to the last Shemitah year, for example, there were some extraordinary large-scale initiatives to relieve debt. Right? Debt forgiveness and relief is one of the central mitzvot of Shemitah. It says in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, Shemitah year comes around, you can't collect on your debts, and you have to just let them go. Now, in Israel, as in I think many or if not most Western countries, chronic indebtedness is a really serious problem. There are many people who are sunk in seemingly intractable debt, and it just gets bigger and bigger, and there's no way out of it. And so there were some incredible initiatives which actually took effect, which were sponsored by members of the Knesset, where tens of thousands of people actually had a large part of their debts remitted. And this was done on the basis of a partnership with banks and utility companies like gas and water, who often among the leading creditors, and also NGOs who would work with the families who were having their debts remitted, in order to make sure that they learned household financial management, so they would hopefully be able to avoid getting into this problem in the future, and they get another chance, and they'd be able to be set firmly on their feet, and hopefully avoid and escape the shackles of debt going forward. And this was a kind of really well thought out initiative, which also involved the government's chief economic advisor at the time, Professor Eugene Kandel, the secular Russian immigrant to Israel, figuring out how to take the value of getting people out of debt in Shemitah and to actually make it work in a sustainable way. Another initiative, which was a beautiful idea but actually never took effect, was that the then environment minister, Amir Peretz, announced that there would be a moratorium on fishing in the Sea of Galilee, in the Kinneret. So the Kinneret was being overfished, and so he set up a fund to compensate fishermen during the Shemitah year not to go fishing in the Shemitah year, so that the stocks which had been exhausted by overfishing would be replenished over that year. He also had a great idea because to open all the national parks in the country free of charge in the Shemitah year, enacting the idea of the commons, which is part of Shemitah, the idea that ultimately the land is not ours. Ultimately, the land begins to God, and so at least in the Shemitah year, everybody should be able to access and enjoy the most beautiful places in the country on equal terms. That one actually never took effect because the government fell shortly afterwards, and we had one of our not infrequent elections right afterwards, and so that got swept off the table by the political chaos. And one thing I think is just really interesting and important to add is that in those discussions, for example, I went to an amazing meeting in the Knesset before the last Shemitah where some of these things were announced. And one of the Knesset members then, Shuli Ma'ulam, gave a talk quoting extensively from Rav Kook's Shabbat Haaretz, and for the introduction, including the passage that we just learned. And what I realized was that this book of Rav Kook's was actually a large part of the reason why people still had 100 years later an inspiring idea of what Shemitah could be, because it was studied. This introduction was studied a lot, and this inspiring vision of Shemitah took root in people's minds and souls. And I think at a certain point, the tension between this inspiring vision that people were exposed to and the uninspiring reality of Shemitah actually became kind of unbearable for people. And people started to think, come on, we've got to make this beautiful vision a reality, or at least take some initial steps towards that. So to look a little bit and to understand a little bit more deeply some of these new initiatives, I think it helps to ask the question, Shemitah of what? Now, many people would say that the fundamental idea of Shemitah is the earth is mine, which is from Leviticus chapter 25, meaning the land belongs to God and not to people. Land is a blessing which is held in trust and to be used ultimately for God's purposes. And that means that in Shemitah, we stop work, acknowledging that it all comes from God. We acknowledge the contingency of our possessions, and we share them with the needy because we know that that's what God wants. And so creative and contemporary applications of Shemitah have to implicitly or explicitly reckon with the question, well, what is the source of our wealth? And clearly, or probably clearly, for most of us today, it is not the land. In Israel, only about less than 2% of people work on the land, and for most people, the source of our wealth and our blessing, insofar as we have it, is not agriculture. So what is the resource which is ultimately the source of our wealth, to which, if you're going to creatively apply Shemitah today, to which it should apply? So one response to that question is to say, well, actually, land is really still the fundamental source of our well-being, but most of us are kind of apt to forget that. Right? Few of us work in agriculture, but we all actually eat food, and so we're dependent on the land. And so one whole area of reconnection to Shemitah is by reconnecting to the land and to farmers, and different ways to become aware of where our food comes from, and to show our sort of gratitude and our awareness of our dependence on farmers, who are often not thanked and not really aware of where people are not really aware of what we owe them. In the United States, this approach has led to an emphasis in Shemitah, connecting Shemitah to local production and stressing land as a community possession, and other kind of related applications in Israel. A second answer to this question, Shemitah of what? What's our ultimate resource? Is that, well, for most of us today, our ultimate resource is time. Our time is really the source of our wealth. And so in Shemitah, the way to express that is to give up, to make a part of our time ownerless, so to speak, in the way that we make the Torah calls us to make our land ownerless during the Shemitah year. In other words, to use it to help others. And Rabbi in Israel, Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Rimon, set up this beautiful and it was a very, very successful initiative of a kind of a Shemitah time bank, so that anyone could volunteer. Professionals, anybody could donate part of their services pro bono, and thousands of hours were donated by architects and psychologists and therapists and social workers and other people, just giving up, expressing that their time is their resource with which they're blessed with God by God to do good things in the world, and giving up some of that and making it ownerless and giving it over to other people. There was a third answer to this question, Shemitah of not, was given by a really interesting initiative to make Shemitah applicable in high tech. So high tech today is Israel's main source of wealth, clearly, but behind high tech is knowledge, right? And we all see that as the digital revolution dematerializes the economy, technology empowers its creators to capture huge markets. And this obviously is only accelerated during Corona, when digital solutions enabled us to work around the limits placed on face-to-face contact, movement, and commerce, resulting in even greater concentration of wealth and power in a small sector of the population. So a friend of mine named Yossi Tsuria, who's a successful high-tech entrepreneur, put together 49 ways, a list of 49 ways of observing Shemitah in high-tech, some of which came down to the idea of releasing tight control of our knowledge during the Shemitah year. For example, he said, well, what if our patents that we discovered that were not central to our business anymore, we sort of put them in our patent pool so that people could use them. What if we would give employees in high-tech companies, opportunities to learn, to study, to renew themselves, to renew their knowledge during Shemitah? And a number of companies did this and said they allowed their employees to go on courses and enrichment programs during the Shemitah year. The company that I was working in at the time, actually, we took this quite seriously. We looked at this list of 49 things, and we picked a few which we would try and do in our company. It was a solar energy company. And it was kind of interesting, I think, what worked and what didn't. And because, to see, what's actually more practical and what's less practical. So one of the things we decided to do was to try to cut our paper use by half in accordance with the environmental values of Shemitah. And that actually worked great. We managed to cut it by easily more than half. At that time, the company used a lot of paper, and the people were addicted to photocopying stuff. And we got rid of that. And that more or less stuck even after the Shmitah. I think that was a real positive thing we were able to do. And another thing we tried to do was to outlaw the sending of work emails after 7 p.m. in the evening. And that lasted for about a week. And it just became clear that the norm of 24/7 availability in a high-tech world, or actually 24/6 in our company, where most of the staff were Shabbat observant, was just too ingrained. The management needed to feel that they could, get you at any time of the day or night if necessary. And that would have needed a real change in mindset to break that pattern, even for a year. So that didn't go anywhere. And then a third thing we did was we set up a weekly series of Shemitah talks. And every week, a different team member gave a talk to the rest of the company about something that interested them. An intern presented a slideshow about their post-army trip to South America. The CEO spoke about his student activism with Soviet Jewry. And it really had a surprising impact on the company culture. We got to know about unknown sides of colleagues whom we work with every day. And it actually did make the company feel a little different in the Shemitah year. It went some way towards softening the hierarchies in the company and acquainting us with the wholeness and the richness of each other's lives. Now, I wouldn't say that there were a huge number of companies which did this, but there were certainly a number who did. And I think, these modest initial experiments suggest that, that firms, can take some of these steps, without, compromising their competitiveness, and which actually express the corporate social responsibility, which is obviously becoming, a dominant theme in business these days. I might finish and just almost finish by talking a little bit about Shemitah after, or in fact during, Corona. These are very tentative thoughts, and I'm not at all sure about them, and I'm interested in people's feedback. But for a long time, if you would talk about, utopian ideas of how you would apply Shemitah in the modern world, and I had a few discussions like that over the year, people would say, but come on, of course, you can't shut down an economy for a whole year. But now, except we know that to a large extent, or some extent, you can. And I'm not saying it was a good thing. For many people, it was a miserable thing. But the unprecedented global lockdown was something like an enforced Shemitah, a compulsory pause in the frenetic busyness of our lives. But not just for Israel, the Jewish people, but for the whole world. Our perpetual motion societies suddenly stopped for a few months. The Nigerian novelist Ben Okri wrote in a very thoughtful piece, let me just find it. It's as if nature's compelling us to be still. Our whole culture teaches us to run away from ourselves, to run outward into the world, to parties, meetings, work, and travel. It's making us stop, as it's as if nature were enforcing Pascal's maxim that the cause of all human unhappiness is the ability to sit still in our own rooms. Well, I'm not sure if I agree with Pascal or Ben Okri, but it's a challenging idea that it made us suddenly stop in a way which was hard previously to imagine was possible. almost like, when Rav Kook spoke of stilling the social order in certain ways from time to time. And that stillness, of course, was not filled most of the time, by inner spiritual contemplation and tranquility. For many of the people, including certainly myself, COVID was filled up with worries about our children, our parents, our friends, and sickness and suffering, and death and bereavement, God forbid, and loneliness and isolation and poverty, and our jobs and our businesses, and disrupted education and broken dreams, and when's all this going to end, and what will life be like afterwards, and so on. That was, that was what it felt like a lot of the time. Some extent still does. But yet, for all that, I think it's been hard for some of us to escape a sharper encounter with our lives, and some moments, during the early months of unusual peace, and some kind of reckoning with the lives that we're living. And it also, I think, enabled us to sense and feel and hear and smell the interconnectedness, different areas of Shemitah. That we experience the connection between stopping our frenetic daily activities and the quality of the world and the environment. We just felt the palpable connections between stopping our routines of driving and flying and experiencing cleaner air and clearer birdsong and bluer skies than we'd ever seen before, those of us who lived in big cities. And we've seen how, when this kind of enforced stoppage of economic activity happens, people need our help, right? That generosity and open-handedness has to be a part of it. We had a choice to respond to the crisis with selfishness or open-handedness, to panic buy food and toilet paper, or to reach out to those suffering. Not even talking about the daily heroism of healthcare workers, but those of us who just did shopping trips for the elderly and other small acts of caring and calling the lonely. And that, when something like this happened, we became open to each other and recognized our need and how much we need to care for each other and how much we depend on each other in ways which I think most of us didn't feel before. So I'm not saying any of this to romanticize COVID at all. It's been miserable and worse than miserable, tragic. But I am saying it in a sense to de-romanticize aspects of Shemitah. That we understand better that actually Shemitah is not everybody stopping work and going on spending the year just hanging out and enjoying themselves and refreshing and rising to spiritual heights. But actually observing Shemitah was hard, as the Torah very well understood. And so, although I think as we've had this experience, we wouldn't want to have it again, at least not in the way that we have. But I think we have learned that we can stop and change aspects of our lives that were dysfunctional and harmful, but which actually seemed unavoidable. We've learned that they're not unavoidable. It's enabled us to break some bad habits. Instead of flying thousands of miles to meetings, people do Zoom and it works fine. Like, people have tasted the benefits of online working. I know there's a balance to be found between remote work and in-person working, but it'll probably, the balance will probably be healthier, involving less commuting and pollution and stress than were normal before. And we've seen how the pausing of society has brought about a rejuvenation of nature. And so, critical environmental problems like climate change that had seemed intractable now seem perhaps a little bit less so. So those are, some reflections on how, which COVID has named, I think, deepened and perhaps changed my understanding of Shemitah. But again, as I said, they are tentative, and I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts on them. But I think I'll end, if I can, by by showing you a 2-minute video, which was made by Shemita Alive, which was one of the main organizations promoting creative ways of observing Shemitah.
And
I think it
there
really
are guests,
captures,
by the way, for March. Sorry.
Okay, so I hope I'm not stealing my thunder
No, not
by
at all.
showing you this video. But I think it encapsulates quite beautifully how they were able to take these ideals and values which Rav Kook and others spoke about and actually make them real and practical in terms of Israeli society today. So I'm going to try and do this, and if I can't manage to do it, I'll take it as a sign that I'm supposed to leave it for them. And but let me just have a go. Hang on a sec. No, I can't do it. All right, so so anyway, I've talked for long enough, and I'm happy to take questions. Okay, over to you.
Okay, so first thing, thank you very much, Yediya. It was really amazing, and we already have some questions from our members. So I will let them ask by the, in the order they asked. So Deborah, are you still with us? Would you like to ask the questions, or would you like me to ask it on your behalf?
No, I'll ask it. That's fine. This was just a wonderful talk and really important because I've been asked this very question by friends who know nothing about Shemitah. How do you possibly do that? And what do they do in Israel? And I never had an answer, and now I do. So I'm going to convene them all. You can't tell them. But here's a question I do have. Some of the ideas you mentioned, which were very creative, the remission of debt, the time bank where there was all this volunteering. My question is, were the recipients of these limited to Jews in Israel, or did this include Israeli Arabs and communities that are marginalized but not Jewish?
That's a really good and important question. The debt related things were open to all populations and communities because it was a government sponsored scheme, so it was open to people from all populations and ethnic groups. And the time bank initiative, I'm not sure about, to tell you the truth. Knowing the people who were involved in it, I would think that it was open to all, but I can't say that for sure. Sorry. By the way, I did put the link to the video in the chat, so you can watch it afterwards. And it's in Hebrew, but it's got English subtitles, and you'll certainly get the idea.
Yeah. Now we have Mandy and then Joyce. Mandy Brown, would you like to?
Sure. I'm wondering what position the Knesset took during Shmitan, and if they were helping to sponsor it in any way, or if they said anything about it, and if so, what?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the last Shemitah year, 2014 to 2015, the Knesset was very active in promoting some of the measures which I've spoken about, the moratorium on fishing, the national parks, and the debt relief, and also making education about the social and economic and environmental ideas of Shemitah part of the curriculum in every school during that year. I mentioned a meeting I went to. There was a Shemitah caucus which was set up in the Knesset, and so I went to one of their early meetings, and it was just extraordinary that there were Knesset members across the political and the religious spectrum who were really into this. religious and Haredi and secular and left wing and right wing, because they saw it. It was a religious value which had the potential to reach across the divides of Israeli society and speak to all kinds of people. I have to say, this has happened less, if at all, in the lead up to this coming year. And I think the reason is simply that it's just all been so chaotic. I mean, we've had political chaos with four elections in the 2 years leading up to Shemitah, and then Corona chaos, which completely occupied the the years leading up to Shemitah. And so, for those reasons mainly, Shemitah has just not made it onto the agenda of people's, of Knesset members' sort of concern. And, it's a pity, but at the same time, understandable. But I really think that the fact that it happens, is irreversible. And I think that, as we get back to normal times, I think that these initiatives will only flourish and grow, because they just, felt so right to so many people at the time.
Thank you. Now we have 2 questions actually from Nancy Kaplan, and then later on Sarah Levine. So we'll start with you, Nancy.
Oh, okay. I thought I just to put it in the chat. Okay. So
Yeah.
I was curious about your take on the recent tree planting in the Negev, where the Israeli JNF got permission from the chief rabbinate to plant trees for nationalist reasons during Shemitah, and whether the Israeli public interpreted that as undermining Shemitah, or whether people weren't really paying that much attention to it.
I think most people weren't paying much attention to it. I think to some extent, people who opposed the tree planting sort of discovered Shemitah as a result of their opposition to the tree planting rather than vice versa. And so I think to some extent that the Shemitah-based reason was enlisted as a way to oppose the tree planting in a way which it felt like the politicization of a religious issue. And that having been said, it doesn't seem to me, in my humble opinion, and I haven't looked into it deeply, but it doesn't seem to me that the nationalist reasons which were offered for getting around Shemitah and for planting the trees, it doesn't seem to me like those reasons were convincing. I mean, you're not supposed to plant trees in Shemitah, and I haven't heard a reason to go against that. But that's my inexpert halachic opinion.
No. And well, it was, Nancy had the 2 questions. Are there any more questions? And if no, we will conclude. Rabbi Sinclair, I really want to thank you for enlightening us today. For me, it was a really great, lesson in a way. We learned a lot, and we're really happy that you were able to join us. And I do wish to remind everybody about our community prayer for Congregation Bet Israel in Texas. We shared the link. I will share it again now. Thank you for being a part of the session. We will share the recording with all the registrants once we upload it to our YouTube channel. And as Rabbi Sinclair already mentioned, in March, we're going to have guests from Shmita Israelit to speak about Shemita Israelit. But next month guest is actually going to be Professor Rachel Benziman of a non-for-profit called Fresh Start, who will tell us more about financial aspects of Shemitah in today's Israel. So Yedidia, if you want to say a couple of last words before we say goodbye to everybody.
If I may be permitted a brief marketing message. If you want to learn more about this, I have a book about all this and much more coming out from Maggid Books in February. So should be available on their website from the beginning of February. And I really want to thank you all for joining, and it was a really great privilege to you, and it was very meaningful to me to share some of these things which are very close to my heart with all of you. And I'm sorry that you haven't been able to visit Israel for some time, but I really hope to be able to see you here soon, so you can experience from close up again what's really going on here. So thank you very much again.
Yes, and we will share, once you have the book published, I would love to share it with our, with the attendees of this session. So thank you again, everybody. And we're looking forward to seeing you soon. Stay warm, stay healthy, and happy Tu B'Shvat, everybody.
Happy Tu B'Shvat, everybody. I didn't get to that, but happy Tu B'Shvat.
Yes.
This was wonderful.
Thank you, Yediya. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.